But IU women's basketball, I was there in attendance as a fan in the crowds. I sat on the other end, so the student section. There's really no student section for IU women's games. It's all general admission, so you just go in, you can sit wherever. And so I was sitting not where the student section typically is, which is usually where I default to going just because it feels right. I sat on the other side, which is a completely different experience and very different and strange. It was cool. I loved it. Kind of behind the Iowa bench. And this game was very fun at the beginning, and then obviously got a little bit tricky towards the end. Fortunately, it was close at the end. Unfortunately, did not fall the way of the Hoosiers. But they were taking on number 14 Iowa, who it was and now, of course, still is undefeated in Big Ten play. A very good team. I hadn't watched Iowa very much coming into this game, so I didn't have very many thoughts I didn't have a very good read of what Iowa was. What I did know, or what I thought I knew, was that they were kind of a hot start team. They were a team that started fast, they played hard right away, builds up a 30-12 lead in the first quarter or first half or whatever at some point in the second quarter, and then the game's just over, right? And then Iowa can kind of cruise to victory. But I had that perception when they played Rutgers, which was, I believe, their Big Ten game, kind of like IU Illinois, the Big Ten, the one teaser Big Ten game that we get a month before the rest of the Big Ten schedule actually starts. And at the time, I didn't know Rutgers was bad. I didn't know Rutgers was going to be at the very bottom of the Big Ten and probably stay there throughout the entire season. I believe Iowa won 79-36. They had a very fast start. And so I'd only watched Iowa against truly inferior competition. And so I had the feeling that they were a fast start team. That was kind of their identity. It might not be, but I noticed that, again, at home against Penn State, they ended up scoring 99, started very hot. I think Iowa has troubles on the road. I think they struggle on the road. They had some close wins against inferior competition on the road. Indiana now is another example. Obviously, a lot of their losses have occurred away from home. So it seems like Iowa is a team in the Big Ten that performs noticeably better when they are in their own building. Every team performs better when they're in their own building for the most part, but for Iowa, it seems like there's a pretty sizable gap, which is important to note and is something that could possibly suggest that Iowa's a team that could take kind of an upset loss in the regular season on the road at some point against a team like Indiana, which is why it's so unfortunate that Indiana wasn't able to finish this one off and secure a victory. But look out for Iowa. If they're on the road, I have to look at their schedule moving forward. But if they're on the road against a team that is a little bit tricky, unranked, but, maybe like Minnesota, or Oregon, who's unranked, both of those teams are unranked, probably could be, maybe should be, and definitely are capable of winning some nice big games. I think that could be a spot where Iowa could potentially lose. That's what I would have said about Indiana if I knew about Iowa's road struggles coming into this game, and I didn't, and it turned out I would have been wrong anyway, at least in terms of predicting the final results. Indiana had a 16-point lead at some point in this game, a very, very nice start. They scored 30 very quickly. They were in a great place. They led 20-8, I believe, at the end of the first quarter. Iowa was shooting terribly. They were shooting very, very poorly, and that's kind of what we saw early on with this lead. Two different halves for Indiana, two different games for the Hoosiers. For the most part, there are a couple things that'll carry over across the halves, and we'll talk about those. But what we saw early on when this team had the lead, right? Iowa was shooting alarmingly poorly from the fields. I believe they were 0% from three for most of, if not all of, the first half. Obviously, very tricky for the Hawkeyes. Their shooting percentage was alarmingly low, 13%, 12.5%, something like that. At the end of the first quarter, very, very bad. Just very, very bad for Iowa. And that kind of disguised a lot of the flaws that Indiana was a little kind of showing in the first and second quarter. IU had great shot making. They had great scoring. They were playing well and scoring in transition, right? They were getting downhill, which was a big deal. The two issues that we kind of saw in the first quarter and in the first half, really, were turnovers and three-point shooting for IU. Over the course of the entire game, they ended up making, I believe, one three-pointer, unless they got one late. Left a little bit early to beat traffic. So, one three-pointer, they were definitely less than 20% from three, without a doubt. And also turnovers early on ended up being a little bit of a factor, but it didn't matter because Iowa, again, was shooting very terribly, and Indiana was able to score and transition in their own right, so you could kind of argue that they were winning the possession battle in that way. But those were two things that I wrote down in the middle of the game in the first half, and I was like, okay, this is if there's an upset, this could be part of why. Not having scoring from around the perimeter and turning the ball over a few times in moments that definitely a turnover should not have occurred. Unforced turnovers. And so those two issues were a little bit persistent in the first half and turned out to be persistent throughout the entire game. But without a doubt, IU offense was incredible early on, and it especially looked good knowing that Iowa wasn't scoring anything on the other end, partially because of some pretty good IU defense and mostly because Iowa simply wasn't making shots. And then the team stepped back on the floor for the third quarter. IU has had massive issues in the third quarter throughout the season. Anytime there's a close game at halftime, if Indiana ends up losing, or anytime there's a close game at all, like this one, if Indiana loses it, it's probably because of a complete third quarter collapse where there is a complete absence in scoring. And that's kind of exactly what happened here. Iowa won the third quarter, 19-4. 4 points throughout the entire 10 minutes for Indiana. Again, not the first time that's happened. Against Minnesota, they seriously looked like they weren't going to score in the third quarter. They ended up scoring 5 late in the final couple minutes there. So some bad third quarters for IU, and that became an issue again, and it allowed Iowa to come back in this game. Now, credit to Iowa, right? Obviously a great team, obviously a very well-coached team, obviously one of the top 15 teams in the country, so a run like this isn't unthinkable. I did notice some pretty significant improvement defensively from the Hawkeyes and just overall urgency. Obviously, they began to shot better. They were able to score a little bit more. Rebounding fell off a cliff for Indiana. Iowa really emphasized the front court. They took control of the front court on both sides of the ball and, of course, were able to shoot well. And the rebounding was a major issue for Indiana again. Now, they ended up winning the rebounding battle, 45-43. Lots of rebounds, right? Lots of extra possessions right here. And again, Indiana technically across the board won the rebounding battle. It didn't feel like it because, the lasting impression of this game for people that were in attendance is probably going to be the third quarter. And again, the scoring run from Iowa and the fact they were able to come back and just how bad that was for the Hoosiers. But won the rebounding battle, which is a big deal. And a lot of that has to do with Zanny Sokenguman coming back. And a lot of that has to do with a roster point that I'm going to make in a couple minutes. But rebounding fell off a cliff. Iowa was shooting well. They had extra opportunities and second chance opportunities as well to supplement that. And again, no offense for Indiana at all whatsoever. The fourth quarter was rather back and forth. Iowa had a little bit more juice. Again, they were the hot hand. They were the team shooting well in the second half. They were the team with more offensive rhythm in the second half and in the fourth quarter. In Indiana, there became a point where late in that game, they're down by 5, they're down by 3, they're up by 1, whatever it was. Every time Indiana was taking the ball at 4, there was this impending feeling of doom within me, and I imagine more people in the stadium, where I did for real feel like there's just no way they were going to score, right? They're at 50 points, they're at 49, whatever it is in the fourth quarter, and there's just that impending feeling of they're not going to find a bucket here. Because in the third quarter, it wasn't that bad shots were being taken. Really nice looks were just off the mark, right? Sokenguman had a couple that, she clapped her hands in frustration. She had her head down. She definitely looked upset that she wasn't making a couple of these shots. And again, she's still getting back in rhythm. She's still finding her flow in the sport of basketball after being out with injury. But still, right under the basket, some of those layups definitely should go down. Short jumpers from short distance, and Sokenguman, those weren't falling for her. Chesky's outside shots weren't falling, and then the supporting cast offense issues for Indiana begin to present themselves once again, where Chesky's gone cold shooting, Zanny Sokenguman's not finishing at the rim. Who else is going to score? Beaumont didn't get the ball enough late. I don't think Makalewski scored at all in this game. So lots of issues for Indiana in that way. And down the stretch, again, not rebounding, so Iowa has second chances. It's one thing if Iowa's just hitting their shots and they get hot at the ends and Indiana's cold. It is what it is. But again, those rebounds, plenty of times where IU defenders are in position to snag defensive rebounds, and instead it's an extra possession for Iowa, and that, of course, turns into a disaster scenario as Iowa storms back and surges ahead and wins this one. So super unfortunate for IU because, again, still looking for their first win in Big Ten play, and it obviously doesn't come here, but it really, really could. And not only that, it could have been a massive win for IU. And if there's any chance of IU salvaging an NCAA tournament resume, this certainly would have helped a great deal. And just, again, when you're up by this much, there are a lot of very good teams in the Big Ten. And Indiana misses a lot of them. I don't believe they play, well, they play these teams on the road for the most part. But IU against Iowa, this is a prime opportunity for them to win a game when they're up by this much, when they're playing this well. Mostly, honestly, the true takeaway for me is you're not going to have a team as good as Iowa playing this poorly again this season, most likely. This was a bad performance for Iowa early on. Again, shooting terribly, was defensive lapses. There were so many issues with Iowa's play in the first half, and Indiana took advantage of that and took a big lead. But if number 14 Iowa, the team that again has been running up the score on people throughout the season, if they're going to come into your building and score 56, there has to be an avenue to victory for Indiana, and there was, and they weren't able to take advantage of that. That's very unfortunate, but it's the way it goes. And so again, they have number 9 Michigan at home in a couple weeks. They have number 23 Washington, who just lost to Purdue, but number 23 Washington at home in a few days. And it's hard for me to imagine a world where, again, a team like number 14 Iowa comes into Assembly Hall and is that bad. And Indiana obviously wasn't able to win this time around and still is winless in Big Ten play. There are 3 teams winless in Big Ten play. It's them, it's Penn State, it's Rutgers. Ironically, Iowa has beaten all 3 of those teams. 3 teams missed the Big Ten tournament, right? So Indiana's going to have to at least find some separation between those teams and obviously catch up to whoever's above them. And I'm at the point now at 0-5 where I'm kind of seriously considering the thought that maybe IU misses the Big Ten tournament. Again, 18 teams in the Big Ten, 15 make the Big Ten tournament in basketball, at least in women's basketball. And so Indiana, that's kind of my goal for their season. Make the Big Ten tournament, maybe win a game, right? That's my realistic goal and expectation for IU. And it'll be interesting to see when they pick up their first win. They play some interesting games coming up. They go to number 19 Ohio State. Obviously, we mentioned number 23 Washington. They go to Purdue. I would say that would be a prime opportunity to win, and it probably is one of the better opportunities to win. But on the road, Mackey Arena really fills up for women's games, and they just beat number 23 Washington in their own building. So I'm concerned about that. But nonetheless, a very tough game, a very unfortunate game. My takeaways, though, aside from what actually happened in the game, we saw improvement, but not sustainment. And that's been an issue for Indiana, primarily because there really isn't very much bench presence. There really isn't very much scoring from the bench. I will say it was better in this game. I believe 8 total points off the bench. Stotine had 4 and Kyaku had 4, if I'm not mistaken. Perhaps it was Noyan with 4 rather than Kyaku. But Kyaku certainly had 4. There were 8 points on the bench total. So a little bit better. But again, Makaleski didn't score at all. She spent a lot of time on the bench. And so Kyaku kind of stepped up in her place and filled up her minutes. And so Makaleski was off the floor quite a bit, but the fact that there was not, again, they ran out of gas in the third quarter. Again, they run out of gas late. Again, they lose a close game. A lot of that has to do with there's not a lot of depth, right? So you can't rotate very much. Chesky plays pretty much the entire game, right? Beaumont plays pretty much the entire game. All of these players, key players, play the whole game. It's been tough on Zania Sokenguman as well. She looked a little bit shaken up towards the end of this one. Again, working her way back from injury, a tough game, highly competitive. She was faced with, some strong competition between the blocks, but just the fact that these players can't rest in the middle of the game is an issue. And down the stretch against teams that do have depth, like Iowa, who is, of course, substituting a lot more. Nebraska, a great example, lots of depth. Indiana kind of collapses down the stretch when they have an opportunity to potentially knock off that team. And so in Maryland as well, Maryland doesn't have as much depth. They're very injured. But still, the lack of depth presence, the lack of bench presence has created a situation where Indiana runs out of gas time and time again in these games. And it's not really their fault. It's just the fact that, there's not as much depth on the roster. The roster is very young, all of those things. It's just unfortunate. But it is a real thing and obviously important to note. My greatest positive takeaway from this game, first of all, won the rebounding battle. Huge deal. Didn't feel like it and, didn't hold up down the stretch, but winning the rebounding battle, even against an Iowa team that was playing very poorly, is a big deal for Indiana. Turnovers were an issue. They were just an issue. But supporting cast, production offensively looked a little bit better. And from a front court roster construction perspective, we saw a lineup that I believe is brand new this season. If it's not brand new, then it was seen very early on and then kind of moved away from because Zania Sokenguman was injured. But we saw, and the part of this might have been because Makaleski was playing poorly, she didn't score at all. And I love her. But Zania Sokenguman and Odessa Noyan were on the floor at the same time in this game for a lot of this game, especially towards the middle portion of it, second quarter, third quarter. So the lineup was Beaumont, Chesky, Caffey, and those two. And that worked. It looked amazing in the first half. And the reason is that, obviously, Indiana is a team that lacks front court presence at all because they typically play with four guards. They typically leave one player alone between the blocks. Zania Sokunguman usually can handle herself down low. This time she was a little bit outmatched by Iowa between the blocks. Again, she's working her way back from injury. Noyan often is outmatched between the blocks when it's just her alone down there and there's four guards. But the two of them together put together some pretty strong front court defense and some pretty strong rim protection in a way that I really appreciated. The caveat there is you can kind of only do that if you're shooting well. If Chesky's shooting well, which she was early on, Beaumont had some nice moments. Caffey was playing very well as well. And so if you are shooting well from outside and you have offensive juice like IU did in the first half, you can do that. And you can put two bigs on the floor. And that's something that really seemed to work. I really think there's something there for IU. And I hope that Terry Moore and the rest of that coaching staff, if obviously it turns out to be the right decision, I hope that they go back to that lineup and go back to that rotation throughout the rest of the season, throughout these next couple games. That'll be something to watch out for. If you are going to be watching the game against Washington in a few days, are Noyan and Sokunguman on the floor at the same time, and how does that look? Typically, that means, Noyan comes in for Matt Gillespie, which is unfortunate. You lose some of a three-point threat. You lose some outside shooting. But that seemed to work, and I liked that. And I liked that in the front court. It kind of allowed Indiana. It shows that Indiana can adapt to teams that have great front courts. You look at a team like Illinois, and Zania Sokunguman was injured for this game. Big reason for why they lost, but with just Noyan all alone between the blocks, and sometimes they put Matt Gillespie in there, and she was kind of a good 4 for Indiana. She played the 5 even at certain points of the season. But when you have Odessa Noyan all alone between the blocks, Illinois with Barry Wallace and Sierra Parchment, right, two bigs and guards that love to get downhill, you look at a situation where, again, that front court was just attacked all day long. Illinois scored 78. They won 78-57. They led by as many as 30 in that game. They had their way offensively. They don't shoot the three. They don't like to shoot the three, and so they like to get downhill, and they were able to do that against Indiana. But if Indiana was in a situation where, you put and obviously they weren't scoring very much. They weren't shooting well. Chesky was really locked down by Illinois defensively. So there are some caveats here, but it's a nice thought to think that they could have, if she was injured, put Zania Sokunguman on the floor, and defensively alongside Noyan, there would have been a little bit more. There would have a little bit more substance defensively for them to defend Illinois. So in the future, when Indiana plays teams that have great front courts, and there are plenty of them in the Big Ten, I believe there's a situation where with both Z and Noyan on the floor, they could potentially find their footing a little bit better. And it's not just a situation where the game's over. Because in the Illinois game, after the first quarter, the game was over, right? It felt that way. It looked that way. It seemed that way. Illinois offensively was just never going to be contested down low. And so when you at least apply that resistance in the front court with Z and Noyan on the floor, maybe there is something there. Z can do that on her own oftentimes, but again, if you're playing superior front courts and superior teams with maybe two bigs down low that are great, or one that's just, like a Lauren Betts, who's just far and away going to the WNBA, no doubt, great player, maybe you need a little bit more help in that area. And then it seems like Indiana's going to be able to do that, and the offense can still function, which feels very good. Again, they kind of need to be shooting well for that to be the case. Chesky kind of needs to be in rhythm, but if they are, they've got a real chance to contend against a team with a great front court, which is something I did not know could be said a few days ago, a few weeks ago, a few months ago, especially when Sokunguman was hurt. Now she's obviously back, and Indiana seems to be in a slightly better place. So those are my thoughts on IU women's basketball after their loss to Iowa. Again, they'll play Washington in a few days. I'm heartbroken because I have a meeting during that game. I won't be there. That was one of those that I circled because I love Washington. I love Minnesota, and I was there, and it was great. It's on the call for WIUX. And I was there for I really liked Washington earlier in the season and wanted to be there for the Washington game. And unfortunately, I won't, which is unfortunate. But I'll record it. I'll watch it later that night and have a great time and cheer on the team after the game has already occurred. We'll discuss it on the show probably the day after. But IU women's basketball, they've got a couple more ranked opponents coming up, right? They've got a couple other tough games. At Ohio State will be difficult. Jelani Cambridge is awesome. At Purdue, apparently will be difficult after their win over Washington. And we'll see when that first win in the Big Ten season comes for Indiana. And we can only hope that it will come soon.